This is Dr. James Strickler, and this is a course in United States history. This lecture concerns Chapter 24, World War II, in the United States history textbook, American Yawp. The beginning of this chapter is about the origins of the war in the Pacific. Now, to understand why we divide our discussion of World War II between the war in the Pacific and the war in Europe, it's important to recognize that there were two discrete theaters to the war. This is because you had two different belligerents. In Europe, you had Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, you had Imperial Japan. And what connected these two wars together was the United States of America. The United States first became involved in World War II because of the actions of the Japanese. But the Japanese were allied with the Germans, which led the Americans to also declare war on Germany, which then brought these two separate areas of war together into one global spanning war. But the origins of that war with the Japanese, which pulled the United States into World War II, and in fact made it into World War II, actually began much earlier. In 1932, Japan invaded China. In particular, they invaded the province of Manchuria. China was not the same sort of centralized state that we have today. Instead, China was ruled by a series of warlords that each had their own sort of private kingdoms within the Greater China. This made them easily defeated by the Japanese when they invaded, because the Japanese could go from attacking one warlord in his little area and defeating him to then move on to another. This was part of Japan's generally expansionist attitude of the time. They believed that they should be a great world power, and that they would get to that place by taking over other countries and bending them to their will. They had already invaded Korea and taken it over, when they then moved on to the invasion of China. Now, the invasion of China brought them into conflict with the United States. You may recall from an earlier chapter in this course that the United States pushed for an open policy with China, whereby any European power could come and do business there. Well, Japan stepping in and taking over a part of China conflicted with that. But the United States was not prepared to go to war with Japan over it, at this time at least. So while they pointed out that in their view what Japan was doing was inappropriate, there was no great feeling to take military action against it at that time. Even if the United States had wanted to take military action, they weren't really capable of doing it, at least not yet. The First World War had sort of worn out the United States' desire to be involved in foreign affairs that would cost American blood. And it would take a great deal more prodding by the Japanese to overcome that attitude. After the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the official U.S. policy, which became known as the Stimson Doctrine, named after the Secretary of the State of the United States at the time, a man named Henry L. Stimson, was that the United States would not get involved in directly contradicting Japan's invasion of China, but it would not recognize what Japan had created there. When Japan took over China, it then took over Manchuria, a province of China. It then formed that area into what it considered to be a new country, called Manchukuo. The United States refused to recognize it as a different country than the rest of China. So, in this way, the United States publicly disputed what Japan had done, but it did not take actions to directly thwart what Japan had done. But Japan moved on to worse actions that got the United States further attention and outraged the international community. Japan continued to push its advantage in China, moving from one great city to another, attacking them and taking them over. The the Japanese army first attacked Beijing and defeated that city, then moved on to Shanghai a couple months later and defeated it. Then, by a couple months later, it was in Nanking. Well, it was called Nanking by Westerners, not called Nanjing by the Chinese. This was the capital of China at the time, and they put up a big fight there. But the Japanese were willing to devastate the city in order to win. Over 250,000 people were killed as Japan took the city of Nanjing. But the Japanese, seemingly offended by the Chinese putting up such fierce resistance, decided to be extra brutal with the people of Nanjing. Not only did they kill over 250,000 of them, but they raped tens of thousands of the women of Nanjing. This became known in the international press as the Rape of Nanjing and became a symbol of Japanese brutality toward the Chinese people. Even as the international community decried what Japan was doing in China, the United States was still reluctant to intervene in the war in any way. This practice of the United States avoiding such international entanglements is sometimes described as isolationism. Here we have a couple of political cartoons from this time period that are actually criticizing the notion of isolationism, trying to make the point that the difficulties around the world will eventually catch up to the United States if the United States doesn't try to intervene in them earlier. Here on the left you have Uncle Sam representing the United States in a separate bed from Europe, where there's all kinds of diseases that are loose analogies for the political strife in Europe at the time of World War II. And Uncle Sam is claiming that he won't catch those diseases just because he's in a separate bed. But we know that diseases can spread much more easily than that. So this is being critical of the notion of isolationism. In the cartoon at the right, you have a bird sitting in a tree, thinking that a Nazi woodpecker who's chopped down all the other trees will grow tired before it gets to the one that the United States woodpecker is in. Again, it's critical of the notion of isolationism, essentially saying that the problems of the world will eventually come to the doorstep of the United States, so the United States should do something about them beforehand. But by no means was this an obvious position for Americans at the time. As I said, they were tired from what had happened in World War I and felt that they had their own problems to deal with the Great Depression. So the idea of going and fighting other people's battles around on the other side of the world was not palatable for most Americans, at least not yet. Now, just as an aside, you may have noticed the artistic style of these political cartoons and recognize that it's Dr. Seuss, the children's book author and illustrator. Prior to taking up his career making children's books, Dr. Seuss was a political cartoonist. Now, let's talk about the origins of the European War before we move on to talking about how the United States directly got involved in these conflicts. The European War was instigated by the Germans. Now, please recall from an earlier chapter that after World War I, the Germans had been defeated and had been humiliated. They'd been told to disband most of their army, and that they had been ordered to pay reparations to other countries. Then the Great Depression came and made these punishments that were inflicted upon them even worse. This made them ripe for a strong man like Adolf Hitler to come along and promise them that he could make them strong again, that he could stand up to these overburdensome punishments that were inflicted upon them from World War I. This allowed him to rise in the politics of Germany and eventually seize power. Now, as he did this, he had a gift for speaking, for public speaking. He had not been a success in much of anything else in life, but when he discovered his gift for public speaking, he took advantage of that to become the leader of a political movement to make Germany strong again. They initially tried to stage a military takeover, which was unsuccessful. But after serving a time in prison, He then got back into politics and was actually able to become the leader of Germany through democratic processes. This showed how the Germans were tired of being treated badly, tired of feeling weak, and wanted to feel strong again, and were willing to latch onto Hitler as the person who would lead them back to a position of strength. Hitler is often described as a fascist. This is a term that did not originate to describe him. Instead, it's a term that originated in Italy, where there was a leader with similar ambitions to Hitler. His name was Benito Mussolini. He also saw Italy as becoming a stronger nation than it had been in the past, in the recent past. He wanted to regather some of the greatness of Italy that had existed when it was the center of the Roman Empire. So as he described his political movement, he referred back to a symbol of Roman political authority, which was a bundle of sticks, which was known by a term very similar to fascism. So that bundle of sticks that gave him the word was then changed into the word fascism to describe what he did, or describe the political attitudes that he had, a reference back to the authority of Rome. His basic attitude was that things like democracy and liberal rights made a country weak. Instead, what a country needed was a strong ruling class and a focus on the military and a focus on national pride. Those became the hallmarks of fascism. That's why Hitler is also described as a fascist, because he had similar views about the need for Germany to be strong again and how to get there. We know exactly what Hitler's views were because he described them in a book that he wrote while he was in prison. Mein Kampf is the name of it, which translates as My Struggle. In it, Hitler tells the story of how he came to his political beliefs, and he's very forthright about how he wants to accomplish them. He wants a strong German nation, and he's willing to conquer other countries to get there. In fact, he wants more than just a strong country. He wants a strong people. He wants to unite all the German people of Europe, though some of them lived in other countries, such as Switzerland and France and Austria. So he foresaw the need to take over those other countries, to give the German people a single country to be part of. Then he believed that they, being the finest people on earth, should naturally multiply and expand, but they would need what he called living space to move into. The German word for this is Lebensraum. So where would they get the living space? He proposed that they should wage war to the east, take over lands occupied by people who are ethnically Slavic, which is different than German, and either move those people out or kill them in order to get the land for the German people to expand into. This was his program from the beginning, that he made clear in this book, that he wanted to create a strong military country, to take over and defeat other countries, to give room for the German people to expand into. After Germany became ruled by Adolf Hitler, and he set into motion his idea of eventually achieving this Lebensraum by expanding the military and refusing to pay the reparations ordered by the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. He had to deal with the potential threat of Russia. See, as I said, he had published this book. Everyone knew what his ambitions were. But if he were to actually invade countries to the east, this might leave Russia threatened. So what happened was Hitler sent his person in his government who was over foreign affairs, a man named Ribbentrop, to meet with the similar person for the Soviet Union, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Molotov. So these two ministers of foreign affairs worked out a pact, a treaty between the two countries, where they would agree to not attack each other. even as Germany inevitably moved to the east to achieve its living space that Hitler wanted. This could be a benefit for the Soviet Union also, as they could then move west and take over some countries too. They would essentially split Eastern Europe in half between them. The idea of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union splitting the lands of Eastern Europe between them was put into practical motion when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939. This attack was devastating. Germany engaged in a new kind of warfare known by the German word Blitzkrieg, which meant lightning warfare. When Hitler had rebuilt the German military, he did it on the idea of them being able to strike quickly, to not get bogged down in the kind of trench warfare which he had experienced firsthand as a soldier in World War I. He didn't want any political stalemates. Instead, he wanted quick, decisive victories. Well, as Germany invaded Poland from the west, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, and they ended up splitting it in two between them. Now, this didn't just have the effect of destroying Poland as a country and dividing it up between these two. It had a chain reaction of putting Germany at odds with France and England, who declared war on Germany because of its aggression in the east. Now, Hitler had expected this to happen. So after invading Poland, Hitler then invaded France. He followed the same plan that had been followed by the Germans in World War I, and actually invaded France through the Low Countries of the Netherlands and Belgium, and quickly used Blitzkrieg to defeat the French. Within weeks, he had captured Paris and defeated the entire country and took possession of it. Now, when I say he took possession of it, a detail that you don't need to know for the exam, you won't be tested on, is he actually divided France into two. Part of it was directly ruled by Germany, and part of it was left as a supposedly independent France in the south, which was totally beholden, though, to Germany. So Germany took over France, and then it set its sights on defeating Britain. Germany actually wanted to invade Britain and conquer it also. The code name for that plan was Operation Sea Lion. But to then invade Great Britain and take it over, Germany would have to get air superiority over the body of water that separates France and England, called the English Channel, because they would need to move big ships full of lots of troops across the English Channel in order to land them on the British coast and begin the physical invasion of Great Britain. This then led in 1940 to the Battle of Britain, where the British Air Force battled the German Air Force for air superiority over the English Channel. Surprisingly, the British won this battle and made it impossible for Germany to proceed with its Operation Sea Lion, the on-the-ground invasion of Great Britain. But this doesn't mean that Germany was done attacking England. Instead, they transitioned to a lengthy bombing campaign against British cities. This became known as the Blitz, where every night, under cover of dark, German bombers would cross the English Channel and drop bombs on major cities. The way the British dealt with this was they, during the day, would clean up the mess from the previous night, and then when nightfall came, they would hide underground in various bunkers and tunnels, including the subway system of London, to avoid death in the attacks that would inevitably happen during that night. The attitude which came down from the Prime Minister of England, a man named Winston Churchill, was for the British to remain calm and carry on with their lives as much as possible, to never give in no matter how much damage the German bombers did. This caused the war with England to stretch on and on, even as English cities took great damage from the British bombers, from the German bombers. But nonetheless, Hitler felt that Germany had done enough to, had inflicted enough damage on the British that they would not be a big obstacle in the war going forward. This would then allow Hitler to turn his energies more fully to the east, where his grand ambitions for German living space lay. This then led to, in 1941, to the German Operation Barbarossa, the surprise attack on the Soviet Union, or Russia. Now remember, they had been allied together in a sense by the non-aggression pact that they had, which had allowed them to divide Poland. But Hitler always knew that he needed to defeat Russia, so there'd be no threat in that direction, as he expanded there to give his German people the living space that he thought they needed. So it was inevitable that he would eventually attack Russia, despite the non-aggression pact. Now, when he did attack Russia, he had three goals, three different main objectives. In the north, to capture the major Russian city of Leningrad. In the middle, to capture the capital of Moscow. And in the south, to capture the city of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was named after the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Joseph Stalin. But it wasn't a goal for the Germans to capture it just because it would be insulting to Stalin to have a city named after him fall into German hands. No, there was an important strategic need to capture it. This would be the pathway through to oil fields that lay to the south of Stalingrad. One of Germany's difficulties in fighting the Second World War and winning it was they had limited resources of their own. They needed to find a way to get to the raw materials that they needed for their war machine to continue to function. One of those was oil. There aren't big oil fields in Germany. So they needed to capture the lands that had big oil fields, which lay to the south of Stalingrad. So being able to take Stalingrad would be an important key to winning the war. But this is where, much as Hitler dreaded it, the German army got bogged down. They got bogged down because of the willingness of Stalin to sacrifice the Russian people to win the war. During the Battle of Stalingrad, about 850,000 German soldiers were casualties. This means that they were either killed, captured, or wounded and unable to any longer fight. Now that may seem like a massive number, but the Soviet Union's leadership was willing to sacrifice over 2 million of its own soldiers and people to stop the Nazis from taking Stalingrad. Eventually, there in Stalingrad, the Soviet army was able to turn the tide and force the Nazi army back. This was the beginning of the defeat of the Nazis in World War II. And really, credit must be given to the Russian people and the Soviet state for the defeat of the Nazis. Now, of course, the United States enters the war and does its part, battling in from the south and the west against the Nazis. And that ends up being very important. But it was the fact that Stalin was willing to sacrifice over 20 million of his people, over 20 million deaths during the war, that led to the defeat of Hitler. Stalin was willing to kill as many of his people as necessary to not lose to the Nazis. And that's what made the Nazi defeat possible. Now that we know how these two wars got started, and let's talk about how the United States came in to these wars and made them one single global war. World War II. After the Japanese invaded China and continued trying to expand out, while the United States was unwilling to go to war with Japan at that time, the United States did institute an embargo on selling certain key materials to the Japanese that would allow them to continue with their aggression. The most significant of these was oil. This, though, had the opposite effect that was intended. The idea was that if we deprive the Japanese of oil, which they did not have much of within their home territories, that then this would cause the Japanese to lessen some of its ambitions, military ambitions, and maybe even leave Manchuria, because it would not be sustainable to continue to occupy it without enough oil to fuel their army. But it had the opposite effect. It actually caused the Japanese to become more aggressive rather than less aggressive. The reason why was because they were determined to expand their empire, and if they couldn't get oil from the United States, they would just expand it into areas where they could get oil, such as Indonesia, far to the southwest of Japan. So the oil embargo of 1939, rather than causing the Japanese to back off on their ambitions, in fact caused them to become more aggressive. So the Japanese then saw the United States as a significant impediment to them achieving their overall goals. Not only was the United States unwilling to sell them the raw materials that they needed, but the United States was a potential threat on their eastern flank. The United States, as we've already talked about, had a long presence in the Pacific, in places like China and the Philippines, etc. And the United States might be willing eventually to defend those interests militarily. So Japan decided to stage a surprise attack on the American naval fleet in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In a previous chapter, we talked about the significance of Hawaii militarily, that it could allow the United States to control much of the Pacific from that one base centrally located. The Japanese, recognizing the significance of this, staged their surprise attack in December 1941 to try to destroy the American Pacific Fleet while they were at anchor in Pearl Harbor. Now, while the Japanese did succeed in destroying many ships there, their surprise attack was not as successful as they'd hoped, mostly because the American aircraft carriers were at sea at the time that the attack took place. This preserved those aircraft carriers to fight in later battles. And aircraft carriers, other than atomic weapons, are the most powerful weapon of war ever invented. So the United States, being able to still have its aircraft carriers, allowed them to effectively fight the Japanese in the months and years ahead. Now, after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, very quickly the United States declared war on Japan. After the United States Congress voted to declare war on Japan, President Franklin Roosevelt, who was still president at the time, happily signed that measure, and America was at war. FDR, describing the attack on Pearl Harbor as he was trying to prompt America to go to war with Japan, decried that day as a date that would live in infamy. In other words, historians would look back badly on what the Japanese did, as they came in by surprise and killed thousands of Americans. Shortly after declaring war on Japan, the United States then declared war on Germany also, because they were allied with each other. The reason they'd become allied was because they saw themselves as having similar but not incompatible goals. They both wanted to have strong military governments that would expand out for the prestige of their country, as well as to gather resources for their people. So while Germany and Japan were natural allies, this then led the United States, after declaring war on Japan, to shortly thereafter declare war on Germany too. Now, the United States wasn't quite ready to go to war with Germany just yet, but it could begin to supply the Great Britain to allow them to continue to stand up against the German assaults. This became known as the Battle of the Atlantic, as the United States tried to move goods across the Atlantic Ocean to help the British allies against Nazi Germany. It was known as the Battle of Britain because Germany had many submarines known as U-boats that would go out in what were described as wolf packs to attack these ships crossing the Atlantic to prevent them from delivering necessary goods to Great Britain to stay independent of Germany. Well, the United States, like they had done in World War I, organized to avoid these wolf packs of U-boats by moving goods across the Atlantic in convoys that were escorted by military vessels. This then led to direct conflicts between the Soviet Union and the United States, between Nazi Germany and the United States. As the Nazis tried to prevent the supplies from getting across and tried to attack the U.S. Convoys, and the United States tried to defend themselves against the German U-boats. After the United States entered the war in Europe, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, met with Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, to discuss their strategy for defeating Hitler and the German armies. That conference, held at Casablanca in North Africa, led to the position that the Allies, Great Britain and the United States at this point, would accept nothing but unconditional surrender from the Germans. What this meant was that there would be no negotiated peace. The Germans couldn't say, oh, well, we will stop attacking England if you let us keep Poland or something like that. Instead, the only way that there would be peace is if Germany completely surrendered at the mercy of the Allies to do with them as they pleased. Churchill also convinced Roosevelt that the first military strategy for the United States would be to help Great Britain remove the Nazis from North Africa. Then they would proceed across the Mediterranean to invade Italy, as what Winston Churchill referred to as the soft underbelly of Europe. What he thought correctly was that the Italians under Mussolini would not be as prepared to fight as the Germans, and this would be the weak point by which the Allies could enter into the main body of Europe to eventually fight back and conquer the Nazis. They did invade Italy, quickly pressed up the length of Italy. They ran into increased resistance when Hitler, seeing how weak that the Italians were, moved the Nazis in to reinforce them. But eventually the Allies were able to conquer Rome, and this led to the fall of Mussolini's government, and a new government coming into place that was friendly to the Allies. This then effectively removed Italy from the war and left the United States fighting against the Nazis in Europe and Japan in the Pacific. By this point, the United States and Great Britain were allied with the Soviet Union. The United States greatly helped the Soviet Union by supplying them with raw materials and equipment to help them fight the war. So while in an earlier slide I talked about how the eventual victory of the Allies in World War II can to a great extent be credited to the Soviets, and particularly to Stalin's willingness to kill his own people, or I should say sacrifice his own people to defeat the Nazis. It's also true that they couldn't have done that without the material support of the United States, and eventually by the United States entering the war in Europe through France to create another front which would then move German troops away from the conflict with the Soviet Union and better enable the Soviet armies to advance. In fact, it was at a conference between the three leaders in Tehran, that's in Iran, that Joseph Stalin pressed the other two leaders to do exactly that, to invade through France, to set up another front to relieve pressure on his army so that they'd be able to push the Germans back. Franklin Roosevelt was excited about this plan. Winston Churchill was a little more reluctant, but eventually they decided to go forward with it. This then led to the famous invasion known as D-Day. Its official name was Operation Overlord. D-Day was a code name of sorts. When they would talk about when something would happen, they would say like M month D-Day, with the M to be filled in and the D to be filled in by those who knew, so that when they sent it, this information out, if it was captured, it wouldn't reveal when the actual date was. So D in D-Day was just a placeholder for the actual date, which actually ended up being June the 6th of 1944. This was the largest amphibious landing in military history. Now, by amphibious landing, what I mean is bringing land troops to a place of invasion by sea. This was done through the coast of France, moving troops that had been stationed and trained in Great Britain. They established a beachhead and then started moving inland against the German troops, eventually recapturing Paris and finally all of France. With the Allies, Great Britain and the United States, pressing in from the west, and the Soviet Union pressing in from the east, Nazi Germany was caught in between, and it was becoming quickly clear that they were going to lose the war unless something dramatic changed. Hitler tried to arrange this dramatic change by staging a winter counteroffensive in 1944. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. He concentrated his remaining troops to push through the Western Allies' lines and into France. Now, in doing this, it created a bulge in the lines of battle, so it became known as the Battle of the Bulge. While he temporarily knocked the Allies back on their heels, they were eventually able to regroup and push back. And this was the last major offensive by the Nazis. After it failed, they were doomed to lose the war. As the war was drawing to a close in 1945, the three leaders of the Allied countries met in Yalta, on an island in the Mediterranean. There they talked about what their plans were for post-war Europe. In other words, after the Nazis were defeated, what would become of the lands that were conquered? I'll talk more about that on a later slide as we talk about the next meeting of the leaders of these three countries. As the Allies pressed in from west and east and eventually captured most of Germany, there was a race to see who would be the first to get to Berlin and capture or kill Adolf Hitler. While both the Americans were coming from the west and the Soviets from the east trying to accomplish this, it was the Soviets that got to Berlin first. They were very determined. They wanted to kill Hitler after all the carnage that he had inflicted upon their nation. But he wouldn't grant them that thing that they wanted. Instead, he and his top generals committed suicide before their bunker in Berlin could be captured. With his death, even though the German government and army limped on for a few more days before surrender, the war was effectively over. This led to wild celebrations across Europe and the rest of the world. The day that that Germany officially surrendered became known as VE Day, standing for Victory in Europe. After victory in Europe, the leaders of the three Allied countries met for a last time in Potsdam, a city in Germany. Now notice in this photograph, you no longer have Franklin Roosevelt as one of the three leaders. Instead, you have Harry Truman. The reason is because Franklin Roosevelt had died before the war was over. Franklin Roosevelt suffered from severe health conditions brought on by his catching polio earlier in life and being paralyzed from the waist down. He eventually succumbed to those conditions and died before the war was over, early in his 4th term as president. And his vice president, Harry Truman, took over as president of the United States. It was Harry Truman then that went to meet with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill to discuss what would be done with Germany now that it had been conquered. This is where it was decided that Germany would be divided up into pieces, with each of the Allied countries supervising a chunk of the former Germany. Now France was added to this also. As France was restored and its army rebuilt, it took over 1/4 of Germany also. The German capital of Berlin was also divided into 4 pieces among the 4 allies, even though it sat in the midst of the Russian occupation zone. Interestingly, when Harry Truman took over as president, he was unaware that the United States had developed the atomic bomb. It was only after he became president that he was briefed about that. Now, that will become important as we talk about what happened to end the United States war with Japan. The United States war with the Japanese was going on at the same time as the European part of the war. The United States was the main power operating in both theaters. Now, I previously told you about how after the United States implemented an oil embargo and an embargo on other raw materials for Japan, that Japan actually became more aggressive to try to conquer lands where they could get the needed resources. This included them invading the Philippines. Now, you may recall from a previous chapter that the United States had gotten possession of the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. And the United States had military there occupying the Philippines. Well, when the Philippines were captured by the Japanese, thousands of American soldiers were captured also. The Japanese set up a prisoner of war camp at a place called Bataan. But that isn't where they had captured the soldiers at. So they had to move the soldiers to Bataan. And so they set them off on an 80-mile forced march in which they were given no food to eat, no water to drink, and were not allowed to rest. Along the way, during that march, over 10,000 of the captured American soldiers died. This became known as the Bataan Death March. When news of it reached the United States, this brought anti-Japanese sentiments to a fever pitch. Not only had the Japanese started the war with what was considered by the Americans cowardly bombing of Pearl Harbor, but now they had, in violation of all decent conduct, marched over 10,000 American soldiers to death. The Japanese were viewed as evil incarnate at this point, and America decided to do anything it took to defeat them. The first major battle with the Japanese that was successful for the United States was the Battle of the Coral Sea, off the northeast coast of Australia. What was important about this battle was the United States crippled a couple of Japanese aircraft carriers during the battle. This would then prevent them from fighting in a future battle. Even though the Japanese actually inflicted more total damage on the American fleet, the damage inflicted by the Americans in this battle was more strategically important. So while the Japanese could claim that they had won this battle, they won it at too great of a cost. That cost was seen a month later during the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway was a major engagement between both the Japanese and the American fleets. In that battle, all the remaining Japanese aircraft carriers were rendered incapable of continuing to fight, either sunk or so badly damaged that they couldn't continue and had to go back to port to be repaired. This then left the Pacific, in a sense, wide open to the Americans. I mentioned previously that aircraft carriers are the greatest weapon yet invented by humankind other than nuclear bombs. So the fact that the United States had its aircraft carriers intact while the Japanese aircraft carriers were out of commission meant that the United States could press forward across the Pacific. Also recall that it was luck that the United States aircraft carriers were intact, because they were out to sea when the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had happened. If they had been in port and been sunk, the outcome of the Second World War could have been quite different. The United States was able to move across the Pacific then with its Navy, and it engaged in what became known as island hopping. So what the United States would do is it would move forward to some little island in the Pacific, take control of it from the Japanese, build a runway for airplanes, so that then it could move in bombers that could go out ahead of the American fleet to kind of clear the way. Then it would move forward in leaps from one island to another following this same pattern. But this was a very arduous process because the Japanese were determined to not surrender. Part of this was their warrior culture. Part of it was also the fact they knew how much the Americans hated them after what they had done. So there was an assumption by the Japanese that if they allowed themselves to be captured, that they would die an even more horrible death at the hands of the Americans. So, as an example, when the United States got to the island of Iwo Jima, which is nothing more than a pile of volcanic rubble, they found that there were 17,000 Japanese soldiers held up on the island. Well, the United States attacked with 70,000 Marines. Now think about that. The United States had almost 4 times as many soldiers. Yet, in order to capture the island, the United States suffered 30,000 casualties. In other words, almost twice as many Americans as there were Japanese were either killed, missing, or wounded during the battle. And the Japanese fought nearly to the last man before giving up. Famously, at the end of the battle, an American flag was raised on top of the volcanic center of the island, and a picture was taken that has become iconic in American history and served as the model for the Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C. Actually, it's in Arlington, Virginia, outside Washington, D.C. Let me just get that fact straight before moving on. At the same time that the United States was pressing across the Pacific, it was working on developing an atomic bomb. The origin of this came when Franklin Roosevelt was president. He had not heard of anything like an atomic bomb, but he was alerted of the possibility with a letter from Albert Einstein, the famous physicist. Albert Einstein, who was a Jewish refugee from Nazi territories, was concerned that the Nazis would work on an atomic bomb and build it first. So he sent a letter to the President of the United States warning him about this possibility and suggesting that the United States aggressively try to build an atomic bomb. Franklin Roosevelt gave the Army basically a blank check, spend as much money as necessary to build the bomb first. This became known as the Manhattan Project because the first meetings for it took place in Manhattan, New York. But eventually the bomb was completed in New Mexico and detonated there. That first atomic bomb to be detonated was called the Trinity device. Now this is actually an amazing scientific achievement, going from in 1939 merely the theoretical idea of atomic bomb to in 1945 a functioning atomic bomb. From that test then, the United States was able to fashion 2 different kinds of atomic bombs that could be dropped on cities. One was called Fat Man, one was called Little Boy. They're shaped differently because they use slightly different mechanisms for setting off the bomb. I won't go into the technical details for you, but just know that these 2 bombs then became what was moved into the Pacific and eventually dropped on cities in Japan. Those 2 cities that these bombs were dropped on were first Hiroshima and then Nagasaki a few days later. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945 killed about 100,000 people. The one dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th killed about 80,000 people. Harry Truman made the decision to drop the bombs because he had received an estimate from the military that there would be up to 350,000 just American casualties if the United States were forced to take the Japanese islands through conventional combat, not to mention the perhaps millions of Japanese casualties along the way. Remember that during the process of island hopping, the US military had already experienced the fact that the Japanese would fight to the last man without surrendering. This horrified us about the possibility of what it would be like to take the Japanese islands through conventional means. So Harry Truman actually decided that it was the more humane thing to do to drop the bombs on these cities and kill 180,000 Japanese than it would be to potentially sacrifice millions to a conventional invasion. The pictures on the slide that you see are, to the top left, a person suffering from radiation burns after the bombing of Hiroshima. To the bottom left, one of the few remaining buildings near the center of where the bomb blast was. In the center of the page, you have the cloud from the Hiroshima blast, and to its right, the cloud from the Nagasaki blast. These were photographed from the planes that dropped the bombs. And then in the lower right, you have Harry Truman announcing to the United States the existence of the atomic bombs and the strikes that had been inflicted upon Japan. In response to these nuclear strikes, the Japanese emperor then decided to surrender. The formal surrender took place a few days later on the battleship Missouri. You can see here the delegation of the Japanese emperor coming to the battleship to sign the formal surrender papers. This then became known as VJ Day, standing for Victory in Japan. Again, there were wild celebrations across the world, and particularly in the United States, who had won the Pacific War. Famously, on Times Square in New York, one sailor was so overcome with the excitement of the victory that he grabbed a random woman that he didn't know and gave her a big kiss, and it was photographed and published in the newspaper. To this day, we have no idea who the sailor or the woman are that appear in the famous photograph. The chapter in the online textbook also takes some time to talk about the experience of soldiers during the war, what their day-to-day life was like. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this because it's similar to what it was for soldiers in every war. They were tired, they were hungry, they were cold, they were oftentimes bored. Their lives were punctuated by tedious routine with occasional moments of blind terror as they had to fight. That's the story of soldiers in any war. But this war had more than any other war in history. 18 million Americans served in the war. 10 million of them were drafted. Now, many of them went and volunteered because you can potentially get a better deal if you volunteer. This is something to remember in case a draft ever comes around again. That if you show up and volunteer first, you might be given an opportunity to choose which branch of the service you might serve in. For example, choosing to be in the Navy rather than being in the Army, where you'll be out on a ship rather than on the front lines of the battle. But if you wait to get drafted, you have no choice of where you're going to go. During the war, the United States economy had to be completely reconfigured to fight the war. Now, this actually ended up being a great economic benefit for the country. You'll remember from the previous chapter that the United States was still in the throes of the Great Depression when World War II started. Yes, there had been a bunch of government programs set up to try to help the people with the trying aspects of the Depression, try to help them stay in their homes and have food to eat and jobs and things like that. But these had not entirely alleviated the effects of the Depression. In fact, some economists even argue that they caused the Depression to linger longer. Now, whether that's true or not, what we do know for sure is that the Depression had not passed by the time World War II started. It was World War II that brought us out of the Depression. Now, how has that happened? Well, you now suddenly need a bunch of goods and services delivered in order to fight the war. The government will pay for those with deficit spending if necessary. In other words, just printing money or borrowing money. Oftentimes borrowing money from the American people themselves as they bought what were called war bonds. Then as the government spends this money to provide things for the war, this then employs people. And in that way, the country is lifted out of the Depression. Now, to manage, though, this war economy, the United States had to make sure that the right sorts of things were being made for the war. So an Office of War Mobilization and Reconversion was set up to retool the American economy to produce goods for war. So for example, a car factory might be reconfigured to now produce tanks or planes or something like that. This is illustrated by the poster to the left, where you can see a factory worker pouring out metal to the slogan "Pour it on," that's being changed into airplanes to go fight the war. But that's only half the battle. You need materials to go into the factories to make the machines for war. And materials can become very scarce during a time of war. So an entire system of salvage and recycling was set up to get important items, such as in the poster on the right, tin, which could be found in things like toothpaste tubes and shaving cream tubes. The War Production Board oversaw the retooling of American factories to produce the things that were needed. So between these two things, retooling the factories and conserving the needed materials, the United States was able to set up a whole system of producing the equipment which was necessary to win the war. But as you are using these materials to produce the things necessary for war, including food and supplies for the soldiers out fighting, that means you have to be careful about how these things are used at home. In fact, you may need to ration those items. And this is what happened. The United States put limits on how much of each critical product individual people and families could have. From gasoline to sugar, there were ration requirements. So what would happen is people would get ration cards that they could use to spend on these things. So here we see a ration card for gasoline for a person who could take it in to fill their tank with gasoline only so many times. And they would realize that they would run out of gas if they were careless with it, because they were only about being allowed a certain amount. In this way, it controlled how much people used of the critical products so that the proper amounts could be funneled to the war effort. There was also a shortage of workers during this time period in the United States, as so many American men went off to fight in the war. This led to the implementation of the Bracero Program, where workers were invited to come to the United States from Mexico to work on a temporary basis, particularly in agricultural production, such as harvesting crops from fields. This has remained a part of American society ever since. Even though the Bracero Program no longer exists, the idea of Mexicans coming to the United States to harvest crops, to earn money for their families back home, and provided needed labor in the United States continues on to this day. And it was a critical feature of the war effort. It wasn't just immigrants from Mexico that were critical to the war effort. Women were also. Most famously, as men went to fight in the war, factories were left without enough men to fill all the jobs. And so women took jobs in those factories. This led to a popular song called Rosie the Riveter, about a woman working, putting rivets into equipment in a factory. This then led to this iconic image shown in the poster on the right, where a woman is making a muscle saying, "We can do it," trying to inspire other women that they can go work in the factories to support the war effort. That image became known as Rosie the Riveter. Women who weren't working in the factories had other ways to support the war effort, such as by joining the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross was a volunteer charitable organization that organized gathering materials to support the war effort, such as care packages for the soldiers, or famously now, blood drives are run by the American Red Cross. Women became the primary component of the Red Cross to support its efforts in support of the men out fighting the war. Now, When women joined the Red Cross, not only did they work in these capacities to help gather things for the troops, but they also trained to provide services, particularly as nurses' aides. There was a shortage of nurses in American hospitals as they were moved out to things like hospital ships to help support the American war effort. So Red Cross volunteers who had been trained could move into those capacities. So you have a chain of effort here. Red Cross volunteers take over in the hospitals. Women who had been trained in the hospitals could then move to the military hospitals, which then allowed men who otherwise would have been in those roles in the military hospitals to then move to the front lines. And so the Red Cross volunteers enabled a chain of people moving to different jobs to support the war effort. Women could also directly join the military itself in support positions. For example, there was the Army's Women Auxiliary Corps, otherwise known as the WACs, and there's the Navy's Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, otherwise known as the WAVES. These were women who actually joined the military and were sometimes put in position as officers within the military, who provided non-combat support, such as working in offices, doing paperwork and the like. Now, while they may not have been fighting on the front lines, again, this is important support, because as they move into those positions, then you don't need men in those positions, and the men can go fight on the front lines. World War II also had an important impact on race relations in the United States. I previously talked about in another chapter how during World War I, many leaders in the civil rights movement had encouraged young black men to join the war effort. The belief was that as young black men went out and fought for the United States of America in World War I, that white people would then see their efforts and as a result develop better feelings for them. They would see them as patriotic, productive members of society. And this would then lead to a decrease in racism and to an improvement of the rights and opportunities for black Americans. Well, a similar attitude could be seen in World War II, and it seemed to actually have more effect than the volunteers in World War I had. Early on in the war, a civil rights activist named Philip Randolph, who was the leader of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, planned a massive march on Washington, D.C. to demand better treatment for black Americans during the midst of the war. He saw this as an opportunity to, at a time of crisis, to try to instigate change. Now, the union that he was the leader of, the Sleeping Car Porters, was primarily a job classification that was held by black men. They were the servants on the sleeping cars on trains. So this union was a union of black employees. So he used his position over this large number of black workers to try to organize this march. When Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, found out about the march, he thought it was a bad idea. He didn't want to see conflict and division within the country in the midst of war. So he gave in. Now, when I say he gave in, what I mean is he issued Executive Order 8802. What this did was it required fair employment practices within the United States government and within all contractors who were providing goods and services to the United States government in support of the war effort. In other words, the defense industries. So, any government agency or any business contracted to provide things for the government now had to hire people on a non-discriminatory basis. This was a huge civil rights advancement made possible by the war, the necessity for employment during the war, and the pressure of people such as Philip Randolph. Another important advancement for black Americans during the war was the movement of black troops into the armed forces. An example of this was the Tuskegee Airmen, who were trained on a segregated basis to fly planes in support of the American war effort. They were called the Tuskegee Airmen because they were trained at the Tuskegee Institute in a nearby airfield. The Tuskegee Institute, remember, was an educational center set up by Booker T. Washington. Remember, it was his belief that if black Americans made the best of themselves, such as by being educated, that they would improve their lot in life enough that eventually white Americans would become even more accepting of them. The training of the Tuskegee Airmen is an example of that kind of effort. The Tuskegee Airmen ended up being skilled flyers that were highly valued in the war effort. This led eventually to the integration of many sorts of U.S. troops during the war. Now, during the war, there was a great concern about the possibility of treasonous spy activity within the United States. The reason for this is the United States has always been a country of immigrants. This included immigrants from Germany and Japan, the primary enemies during the war, and Italy. So during the war, an old law, the Alien Enemy Act, passed in 1798, was used to try to control the potential treasonous acts of these groups. The Alien Enemy Act came from a time when there was great suspicion in the United States about the actions of French people. Remember that the United States was caught in the middle in 1798 between conflicts between Great Britain and France. Well, that law that had been in place since 1798 was now put back into use to put restrictions on people who were in the United States from these enemy countries who were thought suspicious. Now, while it was used to some effect against German and Italian immigrants, it was most profoundly used against Japanese immigrants. The most startling example of how the Japanese immigrants were treated in a very severe discriminatory way was in Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. This was an executive order that authorized the rounding up of people of Japanese descent along West Coast states and the removal of them to inland territories. This was because there was a fear that people of Japanese immigration or Japanese ancestry might be more loyal to the Japanese Empire and could serve as spies or even as saboteurs against the United States. These populations were primarily concentrated in West Coast states such as California and Oregon. And so what happened was, under this order, these people were rounded up and moved to resettlement camps. They were kept in these internment camps until the war came to an end. This was done by a government agency called the War Relocation Authority. This is a startling moment in American history from our modern perspective, where thousands of people, simply because of their race, were moved into camps. Now, many of these people were American citizens, sometimes second-generation American citizens. But they were brought under suspicion merely because of their race, and Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, issued the order to have them imprisoned. Now, when I say imprisoned, the United States government would have not have described it that way at that time. They merely called them internment camps, where they were kept for the duration of the war. There's not evidence that they were too terribly mistreated in these camps. They were provided with safe rooms to stay in, food to eat, etc. But it was a horrible insult to be moved there in the first place. And of course, there was obviously some derogatory racial stuff that happened in connection with it. But the greatest damage was done when they tried to go home after the war was over. They had been forcibly removed from their properties and their businesses, and then shipped away for years. When they returned, their homes and their businesses that had been left vacant were taken over by other people, and it was almost impossible for them to get them back. That was the real injury of this internment. But while the internment of Japanese Americans was a black mark on American history, the worst racist thing that happened during the Second World War was the systematic killing of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime. Adolf Hitler, in his book Mein Kampf, where he outlined his vision for the future of Germany, believed that Germany should be populated by a pure race of Germans, that those who didn't fit that German racial mold should be either removed or even exterminated. And he held his worst animosity for the Jews, who he felt were the cause of all the ills of German society. So he set up a system to systematically capture, move, and then kill the Jews in large camps that were designed solely for the purpose of killing human beings. This entire process became known as the Holocaust. It wasn't just Jews that were killed during it. He also killed people he thought were unfit to live in society, such as people who were handicapped, or who were affiliated with the wrong religion, or who were of the wrong ethnic background, such as Slavs. But Jews were the single group that were exterminated in the largest numbers. The United States, realizing that Jews were being systematically hunted down in Germany, created a War Refugees Board. This was an agency set up to help Jews escape the Nazis. But notice it wasn't created until 1944. The war would be over by 1945. While it did have success in getting a couple 100,000 Jews, a couple 100,000, I thought I had the number wrong there for a moment, a couple 100,000 Jews out of the Nazi-occupied territories. That is a small amount compared to the 6 million who were exterminated in the Holocaust. Part of the reason for this was that the United States just couldn't believe that the Holocaust was taking place. Even as rumors of it came to the West, it was believed by many people that they were exaggerations, which can happen during war. Remember, this is something that I've mentioned previously in this course, that part of winning a war is convincing your population that the other side are in a sense inhuman, so your population will feel okay about killing them. This often a lot of times leads to exaggerations or lies being told about the enemy. So describing a program in Nazi Germany where they were systematically rounding up and executing Jews would sound like such a horrible thing that some people couldn't believe that it was true. They thought it was just another bit of anti-Nazi propaganda, even though it turned out to actually be true. Eventually the war came to a close, and then it had to be decided what the world would look like after the war, particularly with the United States as arguably the world's only remaining great power after the devastation that had been suffered by Japan and the Soviet Union and France and Great Britain. So Franklin Roosevelt, as the leader of the United States during the heart of the war, tried to propose the pursuit of a particular vision for the post-war world. He described this as his 4 freedoms that he thought all people in the world should have. That they should have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Also freedom from want, in other words, hunger and need, and freedom from fear, in other words, some sort of outside oppression. Now, it's interesting that he would choose these 4 freedoms because 2 of them are what we call negative freedoms, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. This is where governments just simply need to refrain from taking these rights away from people. The other 2 freedoms are what we call positive freedoms. These are ones where the government must take action to provide things for people, to make sure that their needs are met, and that other outside parties can't put them in fear. Franklin Roosevelt thought that these kind of freedoms could be best preserved through some sort of international organization that would allow cooperation between countries and collective security among them. Working toward that end, in 1944, a conference was held in a place called Dumbarton Oaks, a large home in Washington, D.C. It was called the Washington Conversations on International Peace and Security Organization. Now, what was important about this was this conference laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the United Nations. It envisioned an international organization in which what were thought of as the big four policemen of the world, the countries capable of enforcing proper conduct on other countries, would work together to maintain world peace. Those four big policemen were the Soviet Union and China, the United States, and Great Britain. They would eventually, along with France, provide the heart of what would become known as the Security Council when the United Nations was eventually formed. The United Nations came into formal being in 1945 when a conference was held in San Francisco, and the charter was created and signed by over 50 countries. The United Nations Charter set up an organization called the General Assembly, where every country in the world could have a seat and could vote as equals. But the things decided by the United Nations General Assembly would be non-binding. The reason for this is each country would maintain its sovereignty. In other words, its rule over itself, which means it couldn't really be forced to do anything that the United Nations voted to do, unless the big policemen of the United Nations decided to actually mobilize to force people. That mobilization would take place through the UN Security Council, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The United Nations General Assembly that was created in San Francisco in 1945 had its first meeting in 1946 in London, England. This was the beginning of what would continue on to this day, with the United Nations now housed in New York City. The Security Council, though, is the real muscle of the United Nations. Eventually, it would include the 5 nations shown here, along with 10 other nations on a rotating basis. The Security Council is where the United Nations could potentially authorize the use of force to force some country that wasn't behaving in a way that the United Nations saw fit to then comply with what the United Nations wanted. But on the Security Council, the permanent members seen here have veto power over its decisions. In other words, if the UN was going to do something that Russia doesn't like, Russia could stop the United Nations from doing it, or China could, or the United States could. So this would require, in effect, unanimity, a unanimous attitude among these 5 policeman countries for the United Nations to work, to really have power to force people around the world to do what they thought it should do. Well, you're not often going to have that, which is one of the reasons why the United Nations has been generally ineffective during its time in existence. It's become a club where in the General Assembly, people vote on the way they think the world should operate, but have no power to make it operate that way. And the Security Council has done very little because you have members of it that are fundamentally opposed to each other in their basic view of how the world should work. So the United Nations is a potentially good idea that really hasn't done much during its history. The last item to mention in this chapter was an important piece of legislation passed to help soldiers out as they returned to the post-war world. This became popularly known as the GI Bill. The GI Bill, which the GI stands for General Infantry, which became an all-purpose abbreviation which was used to refer to soldiers who had fought in the war. The GI Bill provided certain benefits for soldiers returning from the war. Most particularly, it provided free education for them. They could go to technical schools or to college with the government paying for it. This allowed them to train for new careers after leaving the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or whatever it may be. This led to a upwardly mobile class after the war of people returning from the war, becoming better educated, getting better jobs, which helped drive the economy and the development of American society for the decades to come. And that completes the material for Chapter 24 about the Second World War.